Well, Happy New Year. We're going to start a series tonight of Buddhism basics talks, and we'll start with the story of the Buddha. And to begin, I'm going to start with this reading, and we'll take this sort of as an opening prayer. Ascetic, the seer, in his midday meditation, saw the heavenly beings dancing, exultant, ecstatic, dressed in pure white, holding up banners, singing, cheering wildly. On seeing the day was so joyful, he asked them, "What marvel fills the day with such happiness?" And they answered, "The Bodhisattva, the foremost jewel, has come into the human world to bring well-being to all. That's why we're all so wildly elated." Near Varanasi in Isipatna, the grove where the seers came down to the earth, he, the highest of beings, will set turning the wheel of truth. So as we begin the new year, may we recall our causes of joy and happiness. May we remember our true purpose to bring well-being to all. In Lumbini, in Nepal, there's the site where the Buddha was born, and it's basically a big archaeological dig, and there's a temple that's kind of constructed over the top of this dig where there's remains of an ancient monastery and all of this. And a couple of months ago, some archaeologists were working there. They found the remains of a tree, and so they dug down and they carbon dated what they found, and found that it was about 2,600 years old, and this was reportedly the tree that sheltered the Buddha's mother when he was born. So this discovery was kind of cool because it, more or less fairly proves that Buddhism started 2,600 years ago and at that particular place and time. So as you probably know, the man that we call the Buddha was born Siddhartha Gautama. He's referred to as a prince often. His father, Suddhodana, was basically the head of a clan known as the Sakyans. And so he was something like a king. It's not exactly king in the sense that we normally think of it, but the story goes that as the custom was at that time, when Siddhartha's mother was ready to give birth, she traveled toward her parents' home to have her child, and along the way she stopped in this grove of flowering trees, and she stood beneath one of these trees holding onto a branch, and her son came into the world. And according to legend, this newborn infant took 7 steps in each direction and pointed at the heavens and said, "I am the one, the world-honored one." And as that reading that I gave a few minutes ago, at that point, the heavenly beings, the gods and devas, were exultant about this miraculous birth. And Ascetic, the seer who had witnessed the rejoicing, started making his way to where the prince was there in the Sakyan kingdom. And when Siddhartha was brought to him for a blessing, Ascetic was immediately aware of his importance. But as he was looking at the baby, he began to weep. And the Sakyans who were gathered around were concerned about that. And they said, why are you crying? Is there danger for the prince? And Ascetic said, "Oh, I foresee for the prince no harm. But as for me, my life in this world has no long remainder. I won't get to hear the Dharma of this one with the peerless role, and that's why I'm stricken, afflicted, and pained." Siddhartha's father invited 108 holy men like Ascetic, to bless the infant and make predictions about his future. And most of them said that he would be a great king or a great religious leader who would liberate all beings. Now, Siddhartha's father wasn't crazy about this religious leader idea. He liked the idea of him being a great king, and so he did everything he could to make sure that he was prepared for a life of a political leader. And so he raised him in great luxury. The Buddha later said, "My father even had lotus ponds made in our palaces. One where red lotuses bloomed, one where white lotuses bloomed, one where blue lotuses bloomed. And his sandalwood perfume and clothing were of the finest materials. A sunshade was held over him constantly to protect him from cold, heat, and dust. And during the rainy season, in 4 months, he was entertained by minstrels and dancers, so he didn't even have to go out into the rain. And even his servants ate better food than most people got. But at least one event kind of foreshadowed what was to come. At the beginning of the holy season, his father would preside over a kind of ceremonial groundbreaking when they got ready to do the planting. And so Siddhartha's attendants took him one year to watch, and they put him down under a shade tree. And as he sat there watching, as his father walked behind this jeweled plow, plowing the ground to begin the planting, the attendants were all dancing and everybody was having a great time. Siddhartha was seeing this, and he noticed that the ox that was pulling the plow wasn't having such a great time. And as the ground opened up for the planting, all these insects and worms and so on were exposed. And so birds were coming down and feasting on these insects and things. And so noticing this cycle of suffering, realizing that, this young boy entered a state of jhana, a state of meditative absorption, spontaneously. At 16, Siddhartha's father married him to a beautiful princess, and they lived comfortably in the Sakyan capital. But he was still becoming kind of disenchanted with this life of luxury. And he said later on, he said, although I was endowed with such good fortune, the thought occurred to me, when an untaught, run-of-the-mill person, subject to aging, sees another who is aged, he's horrified and disgusted, oblivious to himself that he is not also beyond aging. And then he said, recognizing that he was subject to aging, he said that the typical young person's intoxication with life entirely dropped away. And then later he had the same thoughts about illness and death. He realized that he was going to get sick and realized that death was inevitable. And so his intoxication with life began to fade. And probably most of you have heard the story of Siddhartha encountering the 4 divine messengers. An old person, a sick person, a dead person, and a holy man. And the story is really probably more mythical than historical. But Siddhartha did experience at some point what we might call a religious conversion. Realized that his wealth and power didn't spare him from the stress of living and dying. And so he determined to find a path to peace. He said later, being subject myself to birth, aging, illness, death, and sorrow, I had sought happiness in that which was also subject to birth, aging, illness, death, and sorrow. And then the thought occurred to me, what if instead I was to seek that which was not born, does not age or grow ill, the sorrowless, the deathless, unbinding nirvana? There's a key teaching in Buddhism called the dependent origination. And it talks about how everything is preconditioned by something else. And I'm not going to go into it right now. We'll maybe spend an evening on that topic one of these days. But basically, what it boils down to is that ignorance is a precondition for our dukkha, for our stress. Dukkha is the Buddhist word that means stress, suffering. And the cycle of stress and coming back to stress is called samsara. And getting out of that loop is nirvana. So as long as ignorance persists, the cycle continues. And it's easier to understand this maybe if we look at it on a more mundane level. We've all done something dumb, like smoke cigarettes or drink until you get a hangover. How many of you had a hangover this morning? Good, I'm proud of you. Nobody. But there's a lot of people who did, I know. Anyway, you do something like that, and you realize that it was kind of dumb, and then you do it again anyway. Right? Happens. So we basically, because you did it the first time, you have this sort of karmic residue that makes you more likely to do it again. And eventually you can get hooked on these things. It becomes a habit, and even kind of an irresistible one. Until at some point you realize that whatever this is really isn't working for you. So a smoker, for example, might reach this conclusion that smoking is dukkha, it's suffering. They won't say it like that, probably, but eventually recognized that the cost and the cigarette burns on your clothes and the coughing and all that kind of stuff is not relaxing, it's not pleasurable, it's stressful. It might be pleasurable over the short run, but over the long term it creates stress. And so then what? Then you try to unbind yourself from that cycle of stress. And that's more or less what the Buddha did. He realized that this life of sensual pleasure that he was living was ultimately going to keep him in this cycle of stress. And so he wanted to break free of that cycle. And nirvana basically means unbinding. That's technically what it means. So he's unbinding himself from this cycle of stress. So there's another Buddhist principle that's not as well known called transcendental dependent origination. And this one explains that liberation comes about precisely because of this dukkha, this stress and this suffering. In other words, freedom from stress is dependent on the stress itself. So the first step in transcending suffering is to be aware that you're suffering. When I was growing up, my father smoked. I think he started when he was about 13. And he started drinking when he was 14 or 15. And he pretty much never ate a meal that didn't include gravy. And if you question the wisdom of this, he would say it wasn't a problem. You know, he smoked, he liked to smoke, and that was that. If you didn't like his drinking, that was your problem, and so on. But his lifestyle eventually cost him 3 wives and relationships with all the children and stepchildren and all that kind of stuff. And then when he died, a few days after his 70th birthday, he had emphysema, diabetes, and heart disease all at once. And he collapsed on the floor of his garage after going out to buy more cigarettes and beer. So he never really acknowledged that these things were stressful. To him, they remained, this sort of sensual gratification from that remained pleasurable. He didn't see the suffering in it. So most of us have better sense than that, at least in most areas, but we tend to perpetuate cycles of suffering, whether it's clinging to our own egos need to be right, or our belief that happiness comes through money or relationships or pumpkin pie or whatever, right? And there's nothing wrong with any of those things in themselves, but when we come back to them over and over again in ways that cause suffering, then that's how we're creating samsara on this sort of micro scale. I've seen a couple of Buddhist teachers, and I think Thich Nhat Hanh's one of them, who talks sometimes about embracing your suffering. And I wouldn't use that same term probably, but if you don't recognize suffering, or if you deny your suffering and you don't accept that it's there, you won't do anything about it. You'll perpetuate it. So to transcend it, you have to recognize it. You have to accept it. And that's what the Buddha did. He recognized the ultimate stressfulness of life, and he decided to do something different. And so he had at least the beginnings of the second factor that you need in order to move toward liberation, because he had faith. At some point, he had seen and heard about these people who dedicate their lives to finding a way out of stress, and he believed strongly enough in himself, he thought he could do this. And so he, at age 29, he shaved off his hair and beard, put on the robe of a mendicant, and left the palace. And so he went to a yogi and he asked for instruction, found the best teacher he could find. And the teacher instructed him, and pretty soon he had exhausted everything that this yogi had to teach in terms of meditation practices and so on. And the teacher even recognized him as a peer and asked him to kind of help lead his community and so on. But the Buddha realized that even though he knew everything there was to know about this particular guy's practice, that it didn't lead away from suffering ultimately. And so he found another yogi, and he went through the same process, learned everything there was to learn, but still wasn't liberated. And so he just went off into the forest as an ascetic and started practicing these very extreme forms of asceticism. Spent his night in cemeteries, scary places like that in order to conquer fear, learned to live on small handfuls of food and a few drops of water every day. And he said that eventually his limbs became like the jointed segments of vines, and his spine stood out like a string of beads, and his ribs were like the rafters of an old barn. His scalp withered like a gourd dried in the hot wind, and if he rubbed his limbs with his hands, his hair would come off. After 6 years of that, he fell to the ground in a faint, completely exhausted. And he might have died, except that this young goat herd happened along. And realizing that this holy man was dying, he milked one of the goats directly into his mouth. He didn't want to touch him because he was a holy man, and this was just a goat herd. But he wanted to save his life, so he managed to get enough goat milk into his mouth that he began to revive a little bit. And no one had ever worked harder or endured more than Siddhartha had. But he realized that even with these extreme practices, he hadn't attained any superior human state, knowledge, or vision. And so he started thinking, well, maybe there's another path to awakening. And he realized that he had been kind of foolish to weaken his body and mind with these austerities. And so when a young woman brought him an offering of rice boiled in milk, he accepted it. And he began going out every morning for alms and trying to rebuild his body and mind. And then one day when he felt strong again, he came to a nice spot along a riverbank, prepared a seat of straw beneath a tree, and sat down to meditate. And he was determined this time not to get up until he had reached his goal. And he said, "My blood may dry up, my bones crumble to dust, but I will not arise until I have achieved awakening." And so depending on which version of the story you hear, he sat there for a day or 7 days or weeks or whatever. But at any rate, he sat for a long time, going deeper and deeper into meditation. And the stories say that he did battle with Mara, with the forces of temptation, throughout this whole time. Mara sent his daughters to seduce him, and armies of demons to frighten him. But the Buddha was undeterred. And finally, Mara challenged his right to enlightenment. And as Siddhartha sat there, he saw the unfolding of countless lives leading to this point. And so he reached down and touched the earth. And so a lot of times, well, in this particular Buddha that we have here is in that pose of touching the earth. He's called on the earth as his witness. And Mother Earth came to his side, vanquished Mara and his armies. So after seeing his own past lives, Siddhartha then continued to sit there and he witnessed beings passing away and reappearing, basically according to their karma. And then finally directed his mind to the knowledge of the ending of the mental processes that lead to suffering. And here's what he said about that. He said, "I discerned that this is suffering. This is the origination of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. And this is the path leading to cessation. My heart, thus knowing, was released from becoming, released from ignorance. With release, I discerned that birth is ended, the holy life fulfilled, the task done. There is nothing further for this world." And so as the morning star rose on this last day, the figure beneath the tree was no longer a seeker of enlightenment. He was a Buddha, a perfectly enlightened one. And I think to tell this story at the beginning of a discussion of the Buddha's teachings I think it's a good way to start talking about a spiritual search, because I think it can be a source of inspiration for our own spiritual journey. When you find yourself going through a difficult time, like he did, accept it and recognize it, and then turn to your faith. And remember, the Buddha's first teacher didn't take him straight to enlightenment, nor did his second. He worked for years, practicing nonstop before he realized his path. And so like him, you need faith in yourself. You need to see that there's a way to transcend samsara. In Buddhism, we put our faith into practice, and as we realize the joy that arises as we transcend our spiritual hindrances, then we can use this growing sense of freedom to nurture our faith and energize our practice. It took a lot of courage for the Buddha to leave the safety and comfort of the palace and go off into the forest. And it takes courage for us to walk our paths too, whatever path we're on. But we can enjoy the fruits of our practice as they ripen, and we can let that fruit nourish our determination as we keep going.